Well, hello again. Now, if you haven't watched the videos on the law, if you haven't done some of the readings, please do. You might want to stop this actually and go back to that. Because to me, I'm just trying to reinforce some elements, trying to bring forward some things that I want to reinforce. I will repeat some things for the reconnect. But emphasis I want to begin with is that when we think of individuals with disabilities and how they're served in our schools, and the law that is basically the foundational elements and is giving a bit of the infrastructure, it's living, it's breathing, so to speak, and there's an element of litigation, legislation, what happens at the state level in terms of interpretation for hearings, and it continues. And honestly, I think it continues, it's very organic, it continues to evolve. So litigation-wise, we know with Brown versus Board of Education, right down the street from Lawrence here in Topeka, Kansas, 1954, the NAACP very strategically brought this case forward to say, hey, segregation, Plessy versus Ferguson, is not the way it should be. We need to bring in more individuals. We don't need to segregate our schools. Now, it didn't involve individuals with disabilities at this point, but it's that cornerstone, that foundation that leads to the conversation about, wait a minute, can we segregate individuals due to race, color, due to gender, due to disability? And as we know, things didn't happen overnight. And my goodness, 1954 happened, and some people think, well, 1955, schools changed automatically. Well, gosh, Little Arkansas is just an example across the country. And it wasn't just limited to Little Rock. I mean, I was talking to a buddy of mine not too long ago in the late 70s, 80s, and the dealings of busing in Boston. And of course, the issues of Chicago when it came to race and other things. So this has been an ongoing thing. But the Little Rock 7 in 1957 really pushing this integration element and the effort that took place. 1,000 National Guard members had to be there to facilitate that. And of course, as things changed throughout the 60s, the March on Washington, where it really put forward the civil rights legislation, and it really put forward how we needed to change things across society. But it also offered application to what we're going to do in the classroom. Now, an element of that, to make things more equal, so to speak, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was passed from the federal level now, taking a local emphasis. So the litigation leads to legislation in a way, and it wasn't directly via Brown versus Board of Education, but the emphasis here is the Great Society's initiative, and Lyndon Johnson's focus here is realizing we need to help out the state and local educational agencies. The Constitution was very focused on the fact that education is a local issue, not a federal issue. And yet, we'll give you federal funds. If you accept those federal funds, we're going to try to change things from the top down. And that did change things at the local level where we were not funding things at an appropriate level. The federal government came in and gave more money, was able to do things in general and education, elementary, middle, and secondary. And that was a big focus there in 1965. Now, during these changes of the 60s, late 60s now, we come into the fact that we're talking about the race equality, of course, equity there. We talk about funding equality with the ESEA, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. I'm getting ahead of myself with ESSA, which is a reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, but it was 2015. But anyways, Willowbrook is an example, and some video I think we offered illustrates this, and that was the attempt to deinstitutionalize individuals with disabilities because of the fact that they need their rights, they need their ability to self-determine, they need to be equals amongst others as well. Now, there's a famous video, television series, Life Goes On, that took place in the early 90s, and the character Corky, and that was Chris Burke, that young man with Down syndrome there. But Rosemary Kennedy is also an illustration of this, and that is, wait a minute here, instead of institutions for individuals with disabilities, and there's books out there that would illustrate folks that throughout the decades, throughout the 19th century and the 20th century, if you are a parent or a family member of an individual with disability, you are often asked, definitely during the early part of the 20th century, all the way through the 60s, if not through the 70s, this recommendation is to institutionalize, particularly individuals with intellectual disabilities, Down syndrome, individuals with significant disabilities, what would today be under the area of autism, but they were thought to be institutionalized. And Chris Burke, when he was born in New York City in 1964, 1965, the parents were told, I think he was the youngest of 7, institutionalize him. And they're like, no, we're going to bring him home. Now, Rosemary Kennedy was one that was raised with her family as well. Another example of what the family's expecting and what the family can do. But where I'm going with this is the family started to say, well, wait a minute here. I'm not going to institutionalize. I'm not going to put my child away. I'm going to keep my child here. I'm going to raise my child. And the Chris Burkes of the world are a good example because by the late 60s, early 70s, now the question is, I'm not institutionalizing my child. What are you going to do with my child when it comes to school? And the schools are like, well, I don't know. We haven't done this in the past. And it led to a series of court cases. Park versus Pennsylvania, Mills versus DC Public Schools, 71 and 72. And this is back to the litigation. And going to the Supreme Court basically saying, hey, we have a child with a disability. We're trying to get this child to be educated at the public schools. And they're coming up with, the public schools are coming up with, well, we can't transport them. Or sure, they can come on in, but we don't have any ramps. We don't have any elevators. Or you can get to school if you can, put the child in a van or something like that. And my goodness, vans weren't, Chrysler wasn't making vans the way they're making them today with the minivans, et cetera, back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And that led to the litigation finding that no, you can't deny public education. You can't deny a least restrictive environment. There's something called the 14th Amendment that says you have this aspect of due process. And so because of that, it led to this focus on individuals with disabilities. And as I mentioned, the Park versus Pennsylvania, which is actually a year before the Mills versus DC Public, emphasizing the 14th Amendment. And that is no state shall deny any person equal protection under the law. And that would include individuals with disabilities. And so if you're going to provide something for a public education and it's free for your typically developing individual, then you need to provide the same for individuals with disabilities. So that litigation led to legislation. So 1975, it's passed, and that's the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act. And we know that's not person-first language, and we know the word handicap we don't want to use. But President Ford signs this in 75. It comes into full implementation by 1978. And the emphasis of this legislation that came out of the litigation is the fact that what we want to emphasize here is that, in a way, I'd like to call it the Parents' Bill of Rights or the Bill of Rights for Children with Disabilities. And one of the reasons I say parents is that in the IDEA, or what is called now Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, but of course at that time it was the ELHC. But anyways, the focus here is parents are mentioned over 100 times. Parents are mentioned over 100 times. Why? Because they're going to advocate and they're going to have the empowerment to support and advocate for their child with a disability. And the key aspects of the law is FAPE, free appropriate public education, LRE, or least restrictive environment. Every child with a disability identified under IDEA, or what used to be the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act, would receive an individualized education program. There's procedural due process, and that means that there's actually the access of due process if things are not being done appropriately by the schools. There's non-discriminatory assessment, meaning we're not going to assess in a manner that would be discriminate to the background of the individual, the language of the individual, the disability of the individual. And I'll give you an example. My father, a school psychologist, went through the state of New York in the late 60s into the early 70s and actually into the late 70s. So for a better part of a decade, did a lot of assessment because at the state level it had changed before the national level. And he was finding a number of individuals being served in more institutionalized setting or separate settings for individuals with, at that time, called mental retardation, but it was now, of course, intellectual disability. But what my father found with this non-discriminatory assessment was a good number of individuals had hearing impairments. And the assessment did not assess and take into consideration for that hearing impairment, so they were being determined mental retarded, or what would be seen as intellectual disability today, due to a hearing challenge. Very inappropriate assessment. It was a discriminatory assessment. And finally, this parental participation. As I mentioned before, the term parent is mentioned over 100 times in the initial legislation to make certain the parent is participating for their child who needs that advocacy and needs that support. Now, the law, as I mentioned before, lives, and it continued to live, and it continued to be modified through the late 70s and through the 80s, including the fact that initially it included the ages of 6 to 18. And so then it expanded up to 21 and went down all the way down to 3. And actually now it's birth. Birth to 3, though, oftentimes is served outside our school setting. But 3 to 21 now is an eligibility for individuals with particular disabilities. And that took place during the 80s. But there was also elements that was established during the 80s. So, for example, the Supreme Court popped back in. So legislation is going along, but as I said, it's living and breathing. So parents of children, Amy Raleigh decided she was deaf, and so they wanted her to have, she was doing fine at the grade level she was producing at the elementary level, but they wanted an interpreter. They wanted more support because they thought that she could even do better. And the Supreme Court brought this up and said, well, listen, there's two criteria primarily for determining a free, appropriate public education. And one is, have the procedures been adequately complied with? And two, is it reasonably calculated to enable a benefit for the child? And in this instance, it was found that, hey, procedures had been followed and Amy was benefiting. Yes, she wasn't receiving maximum, but the law wasn't saying maximum. The law was saying these two components. And so I bring this up in that the litigation continues to clarify the legislation. This goes on in behavior and a number of other things. Now, the most recent reauthorization took place the latter part of the 20th century into the 21st century. Yes, it's been a fair number of years since the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act has been reauthorized, and at that time it was the IDEA Improvement Act, although we still refer to it as IDA, not IDEIA. So that was last in 2004. Now, elements of that during this reauthorization was, first of all, we added more categories, and we'll get to those categories in just a second. But we added categories of autism, TBI, traumatic brain injury. But the big thing also at that time was ADHD was not added as a category, and currently it's not a category. But we also added, not surprisingly, by 1990, now we're dealing with including individuals with disabilities with an IEP. Since the late 70s, many of them are coming to a point where they're about to transition out of school. Well, what should we do to support them transitioning into post-secondary options, work, community, education? 1997, there's a lot of state assessment going on, a lot of focus there. So, of course, we need to be included, if we have a child with a disability, into that. We need to address behavior because that's becoming more and more of a challenge. And how do we include individuals but also deal with the behavioral issues? Technology is becoming such an innovation that in 1997, and since then, every IEP that meets needs to consider whether or not AT is appropriate, assistive technology is appropriate. And then finally, in 2004, things like response to intervention, evidence-based practices, which is aligning with legislation. The Elementary Secondary Education Act passed again in 2001, or what many of us refer to it as is No Child Left Behind, had more of an emphasis on evidence-based practices. So IDEA tried to reflect that in the area of disabilities. So a lot of different things happening with IDEA and the changes, but IDEA itself is focused in on four particular areas, and the ones we're going to focus in on is Part B, and that is services for 3 to 21. But I also want you to know that some of the services, some of the children we will serve, especially at the elementary level, well, also middle secondary, could very well have been receiving services as of birth. Maybe not through our public schools, but through home health care, through health services in our state or local communities, county-based, things of that nature. But also IDEA is trying to help local and state educational agencies, the LEAs and the SEAs, support individuals with disabilities, as well as finding them, defining them, offering a structure. But we're going to focus on Part B. Now, there are 6 principles of IDEA, and I emphasized some elements earlier in terms of kind of foundational components, and these changed just a bit. You'll notice IEP is not in there, and you'll notice I added 0 reject. And so in this instance, first of all, we need to emphasize the fact that regardless of the disability, I cannot reject you from education. And the perfect example to me is, and I cannot recall the court's name of the case, but the circumstances where an individual was born without a brain. They had a brainstem. They were basically able to, with some support, survive, but basically there was no ability from what we knew biologically for them to learn. And so therefore the school system was saying, what can we do? This individual, we can't support this individual. And the court was very clear to say, no, 0 reject means 0 reject. You have to support, you have to serve, and in some way provide an individual education plan or program. That non-discriminatory evaluation is still there, appropriate education, free appropriate public education. Least restrictive environment and all the other components are still very much there, and they're very much the founding elements of what we do for individuals with disabilities based on IDEA. Now, if you want to take a break, feel free to take a break here. Maybe pause it for just a moment and think about those 13 categories we serve under IDEA. And yes, we've defined 13 disabilities. I have a 14th there, and that's one that we often think of, but it's actually not served. And it's not ADHD, which I mentioned earlier. ADHD is not a category in and of itself under IDEA. And you may say, well, wait, students with ADHD are served, Sean. I'm not saying they're not. It's just not under that primary category of ADHD. But that 14th one is not ADHD. It's in some states, not others. Some folks will think it's under special education. IEPs in some states are given to this category, this 14th category. In other states, it's not. And we'll get to that in just a second. But feel free to take a pause if you'd like. Maybe brainstorm with yourself. If you're there with a partner, brainstorm with a partner about some of the other categories that are identified. Well, let's go ahead and move on. So what are they? There they are. And the one I was mentioning there is gifted. Gifted is often seen in, like, the state of Kansas, it's given as an IEP, and yet technically it's not a federal category. Therefore, not federal funds to support it, and the list goes on. But you'll see there specific learning disabilities, and actually the way I've kind of organized it tends to be the prevalence of that disability, although autism is changing. I have it down as 5th right now, and it's increasingly going to 4th or 3rd. OHI, other health impaired, is growing, and that's where you'll find individuals with ADHD being served under OHI due to the elements of OHI. We'll be learning more about some of these disabilities and some of these students as we move on throughout this brief 8 weeks. But I wanted to emphasize that in terms of the different categories we serve. And so therefore there's a definition, there's attributes, there's a process to evaluate, to determine if you have this disability, etc., that leads to your openness to get the services under IDEA. All right, so that was a quick overview of showing some elements of litigation that led to legislation that led to what we have today. It's not entirely complete, but that's why the readings were offered, and that's why also some of the videos were offered to kind of give a broader picture of what we're doing, what IDEA offers in respect to individuals with disabilities, what IDEA offers in respect to the services to be provided, and how they cannot reject and make certain that they're not discriminated when they evaluate, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what will we touch upon each one of these throughout the semester? Probably not. Will we get to the IEP when it comes to appropriate education? Yes. Will we get to the IEP in terms of some evaluation? Yes. In least restricted environment, to a degree. But some of these other things may come up later on in subsequent coursework, but also be reinforced with districts that you work with in terms of how they're implementing IDEA and some of the policies and procedures they've created for IDEA and some of the trainings they provide and some of the paperwork and the processes they provide to align to this foundational element. Now you may be saying, well, Sean, darn it all, why are we creating all these hoops to jump through? And I would argue these individuals, and we can show with history, not too long history in terms of it happened in the mid-20th century, and that is these individuals were excluded. These individuals were not served. They either stayed at home, they were institutionalized, and this disability was a reason that schools were not serving these individuals. And today we'll still see services not being provided. We'll still see the fact that we will because economically we'll put all these individuals together in one building and serve them there because it's cheaper. Whether or not it's appropriate education or in the least restricted environment, well, we're looking at more economics. And the law is clear to say you can't do that. And so the law needs to be there. The law needs to allow parents to advocate, allows for due process to make sure that we're serving these individuals in a manner appropriate. All right, I hope that was helpful. As always, if there's questions, feel free to email me, text me, call me. Hope this can give you a little bit of more of an overview based on the videos and the other readings that you've listened to and or read.